The Sikh tradition began 500 years ago in the Punjab region of South Asia, now divided between India and Pakistan. This beginning is firmly tied to Nanak, born in 1469 in the Common Era, and referred to as Guru Nanak by his followers. Sikh means disciple or student or learner, while Guru in this context means spiritual teacher or spiritual guide. In his lifetime, Nanak composed hundreds of poetic verses containing spiritual and ethical guidance. These were written down and have been reliably preserved, now forming part of the core Sikh sacred text referred to by followers as the Guru Granth Sahib. The central question that we want to answer in this video is, where do Nanak and his teachings fit in the wider spiritual landscape of the South Asia of that period? For Sikhs, the answer is that Nanak founded a new spiritual or religious path, now called Sikhism in the Anglophone West, and typically called Sikhi, translated as the way of the Sikh in Punjabi, which is the language most commonly spoken by Sikhs. Sikhs may take this founding and the novelty of Nanak's spiritual and ethical teachings as a given. They may also point to Nanak's own verses which refer to his being divinely inspired. Nanak lived at a time of considerable flux and innovation in South Asia with respect to beliefs and practices that broadly come under the category religion. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether religion is an appropriate term for these combinations of beliefs and practices because it has strong connotations of either Christianity or post-Enlightenment modernity. But this is a separate issue that we will put aside using religion in a broad sense while being aware of possible latent semantic biases. The wide range of innovative spiritual teachings that flourished in the time and place in which the Sikh tradition began is known as the Bhakti movement. Bhakti translates as devotion, but the Bhakti movement also included elements of social reform and even protest. The Bhakti movement covers a very heterogeneous set of teachings, both in spiritual or metaphysical dimensions and social and ethical dimensions. Some of this heterogeneity is regional and some is temporal, since Bhakti includes teachers from all over South Asia over several centuries. Here are some names of medieval Bhakts. Jayadev, born in the 12th century, Namdev, Ravidas, Ramanand, Kabir, Vallabhacharya, Surdas, and Mirabai. The Bhakti movement is also contemporaneous with the beginning of Islamic rule in the core of South Asia. These Islamic rulers came to South Asia from Central Asia, including what is now Afghanistan, and Persia, now known as Iran. There was significant conversion to Islam among the indigenous population, but this was a gradual process and not geographically uniform. There were Arab Islamic settlements and rulers in parts of South Asia, for example, Sindh on the west coast and Kerala on the southwest coast, but these were not as significant as the later movement from Central Asia. Sufis were an important set of Islamic groups which originated early in the history of Islam in its original geographic locations, but also became significant in South Asia after Islamic rulers became established. Sufism includes mystical elements and groups, but also more orthodox teachers. Sufis were important in spreading Islam among the indigenous population of South Asia. They interacted with Bhakti teachers or leaders, and there were exchanges of ideas, borrowings, and competition among the different Sufi teachers. Here are some examples of medieval South Asian Sufis. Moinuddin Chishti, who lived in the 12th and 13th centuries, Fariduddin Ganshakar, Nizamuddin Aulia, and Ahmad al-Faruqi al-Sarhindi. A broad categorization of Bhakti into two groups is possible. The first is Sagun Bhakti, which focused on worship of the divine in some form. Vaishnavas or followers of Vishnu would be a prime example. The second is Nirgun Bhakti, which focused on the divine as formless or more broadly without measurable or discernible attributes. There were overlaps between the two categories in terms of the range of actual beliefs, but the dichotomy is useful in many respects. While Nanak lived well after the beginning of the Bhakti movement, he does not refer to the Bhakts in his writings. The verses of some of the Bhakts enter the Sikh canon at the time of the third Sikh Guru, Amar Das, who led the community in the third quarter of the 16th century. A compilation of verses made by Guru Amar Das includes those of the first three Sikh Gurus plus those of a number of Bhakts. The Punjabi form is Bhagat, and we will use that term interchangeably going forward. The Bhagats, whose verses are included in Sikh canonical writings, would typically be considered Nirgun Bhagats. This is in keeping with Guru Nanak's teaching that the divine is formless and beyond physical attributes. In the 19th century, the leader of a new religious movement, the Radhaswamis, began to use the term Sant for earlier figures such as the Bhagat Kabir and for the Sikh Guru Nanak. This was an attempt to create a new spiritual lineage for the Radhaswamis. The Sants in this case are typically equated with Nirgun Bhakts. In the early to mid-20th century, this was adopted more widely, especially among Hindi scholars who sought to define a tradition that fitted newer ideas of Hindu identity, especially for the Hindi-speaking northern river plains. In the 1960s, scholarship by academics, mostly based in the US, as part of a new funding for South Asian studies triggered by the Cold War, began to study the devotional literature of the Bhakti movement, as well as other historical events of the period. The term Sant became popular, being appealing for Anglophone writers because of its similarity to the word saint. Some scholars refer to poet-saints in these contexts, but the Hindi or Punjabi word Sant actually has little to do with the Catholic definition of saint, instead denoting a general holy person. It is still employed that way in everyday usage in South Asia. So, beginning in the 20th century, the use of the term Sant, capitalized in English for a group of Nirgun Bhakts and framed as a recognizable lineage, became confused with the more generic indigenous term Sant, meaning a holy person without specifying any lineage or set of beliefs. In the 1960s, the idea that Guru Nanak was part of a Sant tradition gets pushed very strongly by a small number of Western academics and has become commonly accepted. There are two problems with this position. One is with the idea of a recognized Sant tradition existing around the 16th century. The other is with the claim that Guru Nanak was part of such a tradition if it existed. Why should we care? The labeling matters because it has implications for identity and distinctiveness. This is why the Radhaswamis pushed the idea of a Sant tradition with a lineage that included Kabir and Nanak coming after him in time. Sikhs, on the other hand, view Nanak as the founder of a new and original spiritual path, so labeling Nanak as a Sant is seen as diminishing him and the Sikh tradition. Kabir is the Bhagat with the most verses in the Sikh sacred text. Other Bhagats who are well represented include Ravidas and Namdev. The remaining 11 Bhagats have only a small number of verses each. Kabir, Ravidas and Namdev all lived before Nanak, but as we noted earlier, Nanak does not mention them in his verses. Nor does Nanak refer to any predecessor or prior influence, only to divine inspiration. The Bhagats entered the Sikh canon with the third Sikh Guru, Amar Das. They are treated with respect in Sikh writings, but their positioning in the sacred text is subordinate to that of the Sikh Gurus. The Sikh Gurus are viewed as representing a single light or spirit, that of Nanak, and that view is reflected in the way the Gurus sign their verses, as well as in verses of bards in the court of Guru Arjan, the fifth Sikh Guru. The verses of these bards are also in the sacred text and so are authenticated. Thus, the Bhagats, while highly respected, are not put at quite the same level as the Sikh Gurus in terms of being spiritual guides. It is true that the broader teachings of the Bhagats have many similarities to those of the Sikh Gurus, but there are also differences. Hence, even if Nanak is placed within the broad and heterogeneous Bhakti movement, the case for placing him as a successor in a lineage is weak. Scholars who use the idea of a Sant tradition essentially equate it with Nirgun Bhakti, so the claim that Nanak was part of this Sant tradition is a more restrictive version of placing him in the Bhakti movement. One of the arguments for placing Nanak in the Sant tradition is that the term Sant appears often in the Sikh sacred text. But those usages refer to holy men in generic terms, not to followers of individual Sants such as Kabir, Ravidas or Namdev. Another argument is that the language of the Sikh sacred text is Sant Bhasha, meaning the language of the Sants, but that argument turns out to be circular. Our best understanding is that the language of the Sikh sacred text is a mix of regional languages used by a range of writers of the period. Some scholars use the term Sant or capitalized Sant quite broadly to indicate poet-saints in general, without drawing a sharp distinction between Nirgun and Sagun beliefs. Other scholars emphasize the dichotomy and argue for its applicability to the case of the Sikhs, whether or not it was a distinction recognized in the 16th century when the Sikh tradition began. Several scholars have misgivings about whether there was a recognizable Sant tradition, in the sense that those supposedly within that tradition viewed themselves in that manner. So, the scholarly case for any kind of well-defined Sant tradition into which Nanak can be placed is not cut and dried. The current conventional wisdom is that the Sant tradition is a simple amalgam of Vaishnava Bhakti and Nath yogic tradition, with a marginal contribution from Sufism, this is paraphrasing, W. H. MacLeod from 1968. Karine Schomer and W. H. MacLeod, writing in 1987, explicitly credit Pitambar Bhartwal with laying the foundations of the modern notion of a Sant tradition. But Pitambar Bhartwal, who wrote in 1936, clubs Nanak with the founder of the Radha Swamis, Shiv Dayal, subordinating both to Kabir, and is at pains to claim that Nanak is a Hindu. MacLeod, writing in 1997, states that disagreement with his claims must be the result of devotion pushing scholarship aside. Here are some alternative scholarly assessments. Charlotte Vaudeville, writing in 1996, says, the term Sant actually has no precise meaning. Parashuram Chaturvedi defines a Sant as one who observes Satya, or truth, or Shuddh Astiv, a pure way of being. The characteristic quality of a Sant is often said to be Ekras, the state of being immersed in one emotion, that is, Bhakti. But such a definition only refers to a moral ideal, not to a membership in any particular group. Mark Juggensmeyer, writing in 1987, says there is a Sant, or rather Nirgun dimension to many medieval Hindi religious poets, rather than a specific separate lineage of Nirgun Sants. Thomas Gold, writing in 1987, says the North Indian Sants appear more as a diverse collection of spiritual personalities than as a distinct religious tradition. Finally, Karine Schomer, also writing in 1987, states the Sant tradition of the North presents a more fragmented picture. Instead of a single panth, there are many, each with its separate history. If there is no well-defined Sant tradition in the 16th century, then the claim that Guru Nanak was a part of that tradition becomes moot. By contrast, there were individuals who were recognized as Bhagats in that period. The Sikh sacred text includes a selected subset of these individuals and gives them the title of Bhagat, but they are never identified as Sants. The selection of the Bhagats or of their verses reflects the dominant Nirgun stance of the Sikh Gurus, though some verses allow for Sagun aspects. The reasons for that can be conjectured, but the emphasis on the divine as Nirgun is very strong. To recap, Nirgun Bhagats are not identified as Sants in the Sikh sacred text, but simply titled Bhagats. The Bhagats who are included are respectfully treated, but their teachings are clearly subordinated to those of the Sikh Gurus. This indicates a belief and or an intention to define a clear source of primary spiritual authority, the Sikh Gurus, while acknowledging antecedent ideas. But those antecedents are not presented as a unified or coherent tradition that the Sikh Gurus build on. Indeed, the Sikh choice of verses of the Bhagats is based largely on conformity to the corpus of teachings of the Sikh Gurus. Guru Nanak's verses suggest he viewed himself as divinely inspired and offered teachings that superseded existing teachings and traditions. Nanak's verses do not refer to any Bhagat or any human being as a predecessor or source of inspiration. Nanak's successors decided to include carefully chosen verses of a select set of Bhagats, bridging Sikh teachings with those predecessors. The scholarly placement of Nanak and his successors within a broad and heterogeneous Bhakti movement seems unavoidable. Though Sikhs would never label Nanak as a Bhagat, that labeling would violate Sikh ideas of spiritual authority and lineage. But labeling Nanak as a Sant is much more problematic for Sikhs, as it further downgrades Nanak's spiritual authority. This is partly because Sant is a generic term for all kinds of holy men. Furthermore, the idea of a Sant tradition is anachronistic and has a much weaker scholarly basis than the idea of a Bhakti movement. On that basis, there is a weak scholarly case for placing Nanak in a Sant tradition. That tradition itself is a chimera. Even if one accepts such a tradition, there are enough differences between the teachings of Nanak and the Sants to reject Nanak's placement in it, contra scholars like Bhartwal and MacLeod. If we look at the teachings of Nanak versus the Sants, we can look at what Charlotte Vaudeville, one of the foremost writers on the Sants, wrote in 1987. In their religious sensibility as well as in their ethical views, Sants and Vaishnavas remain very close to each other. They share a pessimistic view of mundane life and of family ties. They cordially despise and fear women. This is an acknowledged contrast with the writings of Guru Nanak, which are much more positive about the life of a householder and the status of women. Other differences between Nanak and the Sants include the role of social solidarity and Nanak's concept of hukum, translated as divine order. Claims by some scholars that there was a well-defined Sant tradition in which Nanak must be placed and that disagreement with that position are driven by religious belief are disingenuous. There is a scholarly case that there was no idea of a Sant tradition in the 16th century, and separately that Nanak's teachings are distinctive even within the universe of Bhakti. The difference in self-definition can be seen in the trajectory of groups who followed the teachings of Kabir or of Dadu, a contemporary of Guru Arjan. While Kabir and Dadu were Muslims by birth and ostensibly offered distinctive new spiritual paths, neither Hindu nor Muslim, they did not create institutions that preserved them as distinct, instead becoming absorbed into a larger Hindu category. The writings of Dadu acknowledged Kabir as a spiritual predecessor, in contrast to the Sikh emphasis on novelty and distinctiveness. We can summarize our arguments from the perspective of the politics of scholarship. All historical scholarship has some subjective element because empirical evidence is inevitably incomplete and inferences involve scholarly priors. In the case of religious identity, there are strong political implications of the choice of interpretation. In the case of Sikhs, Bhagats and Sants, the political implications and underlying motivations for promoting the category of Sants have tended to be underappreciated, with some scholars claiming that their interpretation is scholarship, whereas Sikh interpretations are just belief. Instead, there is a clear scholarly case for an interpretation in which there is no Sant lineage or tradition, and that Sikh teachings do not fit into a tradition that might be labeled as Sant. And there is a scholarly case that the invention of a Sant tradition had drivers related to cultural nationalism with strong political implications.